Welcome to the Gilbert's Bar House of Refuge Museum. It's a beloved home of history. For 40 years, it was a house of refuge that was part of the U.S. Life-Saving Service. For the next 30 years, when the U.S. Life-Saving Service merged with the U.S. Revenue Cutter Service to form the Coast Guard, it was a Coast Guard station. It was Coast Guard Station 207. And so it was that for 30 years. Now it's been a museum for over 50 years. That's hard to believe. Now put in here a decade of picnicking. There's a person here today who would come to the House of Refuge for fish fries, she said. I was just talking about it. And I said, well, I'm going to say that it was a decade because in 1945, the House of Refuge was decommissioned. It really was a Coast Guard station. And in 1955, the Historical Society was formed. So on top of that, 40 years, 30 years, 50 years, there was 30 years that this was a turtle research facility. So it's special, it was a marine research, and it specialized in sea turtles. And we'll talk more about that later. So Gilbert's Bar House of Refuge. Now that is a funny name. Now what is a bar? We looked it up in the dictionary. A bar can be a number of things. It could be rocks, it could be a reef, it could be sand, but something that obstructs an opening to a harbor. And so we have a reef, or Anastasia Rock, that obstructed an inlet that was called Gilbert's Bar. Now, I'm sure you're very aware of this magnificent Anastasia Rock formation that we have right here making the waves thunder. Well, that formation of Anastasia Rock, not so elevated, runs along the coast, and it's the foundation for living life, marine life, for our coral formations, but it also is a hazard to navigation. And when it got down south of today's inlet, it was obstructing a natural opening to the harbor that was the Indian River Lagoon, and it was given on maps as Gilbert's Bar. And I have, in recent research, found a map as early as 1842 with Gilbert's Bar written on it. Now, bar, we've been talking about a bar. Who was Gilbert? So, Don Pedro Gilbert was a real pirate. We have verification that he existed. He was a slaver. He was a wicked man. He was captured and he was executed in Boston in 1834. So he was one of our last real pirates that we picture when we have this image of pirates. My husband and I went to Boston, and we went to the public library there, and in their archives they have the transaction of the trial, and we looked at these very old accounts of the trial and how he was hung, and that is a real verifiable story. There is no way that we can prove that Gilbert is connected with our Gilbert's Bar other than legend. But it is a long living legend, and it started appearing about the turn of, in the 1900s, the turn of the century before this one. So that name, it's very colorful. You see all of our we have pirate teddy bears, we have pirate theme parties. People love pirates, but we must realize that that's not the real history of this place. It's a legend, and we love it, and probably it's the basis of the Gilbert's Bar name, but we can't be sure. It's nice to have a colorful name, but it's also a curse. I was doing research in Palm Beach and the Historical Society, and their director at the time said, oh yes, Martin County, I went up there. Yes, I parked right next to the Gilbert's Bar, but I had my son with me, and I didn't think we should go in. And this was a museum person. So it has led to a lot of confusion. It is not a bar where we serve alcohol. It is Gilbert's Bar, House of Refuge. So in 1955, I said before that that was when the Historical Society of Martin County opened the museum. Would you believe in the papers that 2,000 people attended that opening? Such was the interest in this becoming a museum, this historic building. And I have photographs that were taken, and in this little book I'm compiling on the Gilbert's Bar House of Refuge, I'm going to print a few of them because the cars were lined up and you can see the people walking down the beach. I doubt many of us walked today as we were told we could, and it's a long way from the Santa Lucia parking lot to this facility. But 2,000 people came then. What is a house of refuge? So in 1875, Dade County came all the way up here. Its line was about where the Santa Lucia parking lot is, where we were told to park at the curve. That's where the Dade County line was. And they built 5 houses of refuge because no one lived here. The whole population of Dade County, which was so big, they called it the Great State of Dade, was about 100 people. And of course, they didn't live on the barrier island. And so when ships came and were blown against the rocks or the shore, people usually survived, but they were in a terrible fix because there was no way they could get back to civilization. Now look out here, and I'm sure you realize that that is a busy shipping lane, that the Gulf Stream is about 6 miles out. It varies because it moves around, but it is used for the boats going north. And the boats going south use the countercurrent or try to avoid the Gulf Stream, so they are even closer to shore. So if a storm comes up, and we know about storms, don't we? They happen. And they are pushed ashore. Their boat eventually breaks apart, even if it doesn't hit the reef. And so here they are on a desolate, howling wilderness shore. So these 5 houses of refuge were built. The United States government remedied the situation, and it was part of the life-saving service. And 10 years later, 5 more were built. So they had a total of 10 houses of refuge. They were unique to the Florida coast. They weren't built anywhere else in the United States, only in Florida, because we fill the criteria of no population and a gentle coast and a temperate coast, so people could survive, but they needed help. They needed succor and to be given food and drink and a shelter. So in the whole time that we were a part of the life-saving service, there were only about a dozen official keepers of the House of Refuge. It's a little surprising because some of the accounts say, no one lasted. It was so terrible and lonely. But when you think 40 years and only 12 keepers, official keepers, that's not so bad. So what was his job? And why did he take the job? It was really nice to have a house made out of lumber with real shingles on the roof. Most houses in that day, they had no lumber mills in the South Florida at that time. They were made of lumber that washed ashore or logs and with palmetto roofs. So this was a very nice house to have for your family, a substantial house. Also, they got paid $400 a year. That was a great salary, real live money that they could use to buy other things, possibly. But because currency was very rare, there were no banks in South Florida, and usually things were just bartered or there was just no way to have currency other than a government job. So it was sought after. So the keeper, if he had a family, was lucky because he didn't have to talk to himself. He had his kids and his wife perhaps to talk to, because otherwise you really would be isolated. And they also could help. After a storm, and even in the directions from the life-saving service, it says you walk in either direction, from your house of refuge and you look for survivors of shipwreck. And of course, a family could help you do that. Life was primitive and lonely. You saw inside a kerosene lantern. That's how they would light their living quarters after dark. But we've read accounts that the light attracted the mosquitoes, and they would rather sit in the dark and sing to each other and talk than to light a lamp and try to read or something after dark. Water was collected in the cistern, and it was rainwater, and often it was polluted, and there was a lot of illness with our keepers. They had to keep the daily log and send in a transcript to their superiors, who sent it in to the superintendent of the life-saving service, Sumner Kimball. And at first, in 1876, when this house was opened, they had to go all the way up to the village of St. Lucie to deliver their mail and pick up mail. And St. Lucie still exists. It's a little village on the north side of Fort Pierce. It's like a time capsule. You should visit it. But then later, in 1880, a post office was opened in Waveland. And Waveland is what we think of mid-Sewell's Point today. It's kind of where the Stewart Causeway goes over and connects with Sewell's Point. That was Waveland, and it had a post office in 1880. And in 1891, a Sewell's Point post office was opened. And that was just right at the tip of Sewell's Point, within sight of the House of Refuge. So civilization had come to the House of Refuge. They could see other human beings on a regular basis, and that was a big improvement in their lives. So the most active time we have ever had with any of the houses of refuge, any of the 10, was right here, and it was 102 years ago. Back-to-back wrecks of the Georges Valentine. We now have an underwater archaeological site, the 11th in Florida, that was dedicated last night. The plaque is up there on the porch, because the remains of the wreck are out in the water, and on a very clear day, you can see a little darkness where the water is over the boiler, I believe, but part of the shipwreck. We have many photographs of that shipwreck because it was a big thing in the community. And houses were built out of the lumber. It was planed mahogany. It was really nice lumber. Inside they have a ironing board and the bottom of a doorway that was made from that very lumber from that wreck. And as a coincidence, this was in 1904 that the Georges Valentine, and then the next day, the Cosme Cozalda, another shipwrecked, and all the men had to be given refuge here in our house. But that was exactly 100 years before Francis and Jean closed this facility, and we're just opening up after that bludgeoning by those two storms. So this is now, the 2 years have passed that we've been putting it back in shape. So 102 years ago, the most active time in any houses of refuge, unless we find out something we don't know now. We have many wreck reports, and they always are using those two wrecks as the most colorful. There was another very colorful wreck before that of the Lane, and just today, Mr. Kurt Whitaker brought a painting that he painted of that ship that wrecked, and it was immediately hung on the parlor wall in the House of Refuge. So do go in and admire that new painting of an old ship and an old wreck that we had on the shore. In 1915, when it became a Coast Guard station and not a House of Refuge, we had a keeper and his wife, Kate, and all they did was just stay here like they were here already, and they changed their title. He became Surfman #1 instead of being the keeper of the House of Refuge. And it became Station, I think I mentioned this before, Station 207. And a big difference is that they had a small crew. A crew of about 5 men came, and then when we had World War I cranking up, boys from the local area came and augmented the crew, so they had a large crew of about a dozen young men. And they built towers, they scanned the sea and the air, and they walked the beach for enemy invasion. And it made people feel secure that these young men were guarding our shores. And then in World War II, we had a large crew. And I skipped a little part. I wanted to just, in World War II, we had another large crew. And I want to go back that one time a man came to our museum, and his name was Sherman Culpeper. And he said, you know, I grew up, when I was a boy, I lived here. And his father, Charles Culpeper, was a Coast Guardman that was in charge here. And he said, you know, we just lived in the house, and at that time, the house was right where I'm standing now, but it was so close to the ocean that it was just getting battered more than it gets battered today. It was aligned with that cistern. And while the Culpepers lived here and went about their life, Sam Matthews, Sherman said, using block and tackle, cranked the house back from this. We can see on the patio, they put in the dark pavers to show you just where the house was, and then moved it back to where it is now. In preparation for this small book on the House of Refuge, I have been reading more newspaper articles, and I realized that it was probably the 1933 hurricane that damaged the building to such an extent that they were actually thinking of just abandoning it and building another Coast Guard facility. But instead, they improved this one, moved it back, and at that time, they built the boathouse that we use as a gift shop today, and they built 2 elevated cisterns that some of the pictures you will see that 2 big white cisterns were on right at the end of the building, and that time they had running water because gravity provided it, you know, and they even got a bathroom. Before that, it was an outhouse on the end of the dock, I'm afraid to say. Okay, let's see where. Okay, Sherman, in line with the patio. Okay, and jumping back to World War II, when submarines activity was right out here, and there were actually torpedoed ships burning within sight of the residence of Stewart. And people reminisce about the time the earth shook, like the hurricane they just had in Hawaii. The earth shook because one of the torpedoes missed its ship that it was aiming at and hit the reef. And it shook things all the way to Indiantown, and people that were here remember it. And people, the Hartman family was celebrating a birthday at Seymour's, the party place at the end of the Jensen Beach Bridge. And they remember the impact of a torpedo, and they went outside and they could see the ship burning. And don't you know, the Coast Guard man hightailed it. At that time, he wasn't living at the house, but he hightailed it to here when that happened. One thing, I just mentioned the Jensen Beach Bridge, and I remember that I did not say that when the 2,000 people came here for the opening, you know, the causeways were not complete. They were just underway at that time. And so to get here, they had to drive over the rickety Jensen Beach Bridge and then drive down a little sand lane, and I'll have aerial photos showing that era in the little book on the House of Refuge to get here. So that was before we had so many other things to distract us with things to do, and it was on a weekend, not like today being on a Tuesday. So many people came. Okay, during World War II, in 1942, that was when a tower, just like that tower, was built. Maybe not too many original boards are still in it, but the configuration is the same as that tower. And this house was built as a mess hall originally. For a time, it was a marine research facility. It also was an early, the pioneer exhibits for the first museum, when this was the only museum. And then it became the quarters for the keepers more recently. Okay, as I said, this was decommissioned after the war in 1945. So it sat there abandoned, and then the people came and had picnics here. But it was up for, was available for the county to buy, and they were already negotiating to buy it for the county because they wanted it for recreation purposes. But as fate would have it, a man came to town because his parents lived here so often, and his sister lived here. And he was not only an artist, museum gallery type person, he was a museum person. And when he was brought out here to use this for a setting for outdoor painting, he said, "My goodness, this is a treasure. This needs to be preserved." And his name was Val Clare. And there's a plaque in the boathouse, in the gift shop, with saying that he was responsible really for what this museum is and that it was restored originally. He is long gone, but we should remember him. And as things happen, his sister happened to be in a newly formed Seroptimus Club, and her name was Zola Swartout. And somehow they got the most fantastic project for their original project, and that was to create the Historical Society of Martin County, actually called the Martin County Historical Society in that day. But they created the society to be an independent organization, and its mission was to preserve this building and to create a local history museum. So that happened because of that Seroptimus International, and last night they dedicated the underwater preserve, and Seroptimus were here, and they committed themselves to paying for one of the nice signs that we will eventually have, that we have mock-ups of right now. So they're still involved helping the House of Refuge. So at the time it became a museum, it also just happened to have a man here, Ross Witham, who was one of those who knew Val Clare. They would take their turn out here at the House of Refuge. His wife was taking art lessons from Val Clare, and so they were very involved in the beginning of the Historical Society. And Ross had been in World War II, and he had an injury, and he was exercising south of the beach, on the beach south of the House of Refuge. And he found this little loggerhead turtle that was entangled in seaweed. And I'm not sure that turtle actually survived, but that little turtle caused that man to dedicate the rest of his life to research and education and public awareness. And in a way, it kind of took over the life of the Historical Society and the museum, because people loved the turtles being here, and it was called the House of Refuge for Sea Turtles. And we started building turtle tanks, and the two original ones are still there. They're covered with plywood, but we're going to do something to them to make them more attractive. But we held on to those turtle tanks because it was so much a part of the history of this facility and this museum, just as much as the House of Refuge era and the Coast Guard era. The turtle era was very much a part of the history of this. People still want to see the sea turtles, and that hasn't been here since the mid-'80s, because now they have a different way of doing things, much more supervised by scientists. But Ross did so much to make little budding environmentalists, and many people, I think, have gone into environmental research because of his mentoring and his example. So we have this House of Refuge, Gilbert's Bar House of Refuge, 40 years as a House of Refuge, 30 years as a Coast Guard station, now over 50 years as a museum. And what it is, in my estimation, is Martin County's most important artifact, a beloved home of history. Thank you.
This sturdy little house has stood here 130 years facing all the storms. It's amazing, isn't it? We have brought it back, and thankfully it's open again. The House of Refuge, as you know, was built for shipwrecked sailors. And they were all built alike. They were built approximately 20 miles. Every 20 miles was a house of refuge from Key Biscayne to Daytona Beach. And all the houses had wraparound porches. The north porches were eventually enclosed to make a kitchen. They cooked mostly outdoors, but when they needed to cook indoors, there was a kitchen. Only the bare necessities were provided by the life-saving station. When you go in the house, you're going to see some pretty things. They are actually the properties of the wives of the keepers of the House of Refuge. So they did bring their pretty things, but the bare necessities were supplied. About the house, there was no glass in the windows. There was just screens and then the shutters. The screens kept the mosquitoes out, but they didn't even slow down the sandflies. As the Indians called them, the no-see-ums, for good reason. That's not all they had to contend with. I want to read you something that Belle Simmons said when she was 8 years old and lived here. She said, and I quote, "I walked the beach when man-eating sharks followed me along in shallow water and tried to get ashore to me. It was nothing to come upon big black bears digging for turtle eggs." Somehow, black bears on the beach is something I can hardly get my mind around. I can't imagine the threat of it. It would take away a lot of the fun of playing on the beach. If you can see over the door in the kitchen, you'll notice the shotgun. The keeper was ready for the bears. There is also a bear trap. You'll see in the little closet there, a large, evil-looking thing. They were going to take care of the bears. But like everything that the pioneers killed, the bears were used for food. They would skin them. I have no idea if they used the skin for rugs. We like to think so, don't we, Linda? But they skinned the bears, and they cut them into steaks, ate those right away, and then they salted and dried the bear meat for later. One of the hardest things the wife of the keeper had to do was find enough food to feed her family, family if there was a family, and then, to make it palatable. I want to tell you what they had in natural food. We think of Florida having a lot of natural food. It didn't in the beginning. We brought most of it in here. Beside bear, there was deer, there was possum, can you imagine? There was duck, there was turtle, and there were the turtle eggs. It was all variety of fish. And of course, including clam, crab, and also lobster, lots of lobster. Yes, many, many lobster. The vegetables, the natural vegetables, were heart of cabbage palm, Indian pumpkin, and cowpeas. That's not a lot of variety in vegetables. The fruit, we think of this as the land of fruit. The natural fruit at the time, sea grapes and sour oranges. The life-saving service put storage of things in the house for the shipwrecked sailors. There was sugar, flour, canned meat, canned vegetables, coffee. But that was just for the sailors when they came ashore. The keeper had to go, and the keeper had to buy his own staples. He would go to Fort Pierce, which was called Can Town at that time, because that's where they got their canned goods. Many pioneer children were in their late teens before they ever tasted fresh milk. You can imagine that milk would sour here very quickly. They drank canned milk when they had it at all. Water, in fact, was what they used in the place of milk. But let me tell you about the fresh water, the fresh quote-unquote water. It was collected on the roof. The roof was cypress shingles, had a bitter taste. The water had a bitter taste, and it also had a salty taste because the sea breeze came in. So the fresh water was not very good either. What they would do is the drink of choice became coffee, because they could put lots of coffee and boil it a long time, and they couldn't taste the water. The water was, of course, also used for the laundry, but again, it was brown. It would turn everything brown. They did the laundry either if there was enough water in the cistern. You'll see where the cistern is over here. It was taller, but that's where it was. They could use the water in the cistern or from the Indian River, both of which turned their clothing brown. The women would lay their shirts out in the sun to bleach it, but the next time it needed to be washed, it was brown and ugly again. They did bathe in the Indian River. The keepers found this job, for the most part, quite monotonous. Every day they would write in their log, they would write the weather conditions, they would write the ships that they would see going by and how many and the variety, and they would write the condition of the house, which was always bad. It was always bad. They didn't have the supplies to keep the house up. Are we lucky we do? We called this the years of the keepers, months, possibly years of monotony, punctuated by terror and heroism. Over 100 years ago, exactly 102 years ago, just about today, in mid-October, a storm hit. How many of you were here for Wilma? Okay, it was like Wilma. It lasted days, sustained winds of 85 miles an hour, and I'm going to tell you about what happened during that storm 102 years ago. The keeper was Captain William Ray. And knowing that he would have to get up the next morning, the storm was raging, and he knew he'd have to get up early the next morning, walk the beach to see if there were any shipwrecks, if there was anyone that needed his help. So he went to bed rather early. About 8 o'clock at night, he heard a knock on the door, and someone said, "We're shipwrecked, let us in." Now, this is what he was here for, but it still had to be pretty startling. He opened the door, and a big Swedish man came in with his shipmate across his shoulder. The man was seriously injured. The Swedish man and Captain Ray put the injured man to bed, and then they went out in the storm right here, 100 yards offshore. They saw the George's Valentine foundering in the water. If you've gone around and read about the George's Valentine, they saw it foundering in the water. It carried, its cargo were large planks, mahogany planks. They were table-sized planks, 3 by 9 feet, huge. The storm, the waves were throwing them up in the air, banging them down on the beach, banging them down on the rocks. And what he said was that Captain Ray said in his report, it was so loud it sounded like a report of 1,000 rifles. I can't imagine the noise. He and the Swede were able to save 5 more men. This makes a total of 7 from the George's Valentine. When he found the captain of the George's Valentine, his first words were, "Oh, my master, the rocks are so bad." You've seen the rocks out here? Can you imagine the waves throwing you against the rocks? It shredded their clothes, and then it shredded their skin. The captain had lost 1/5 of his skin. All the men were naked, they were chilled, they were exhausted, and some very seriously injured. Captain Ray brought them in and used and tended their wounds as best he could, and then he sent for a doctor in Stewart. Now, Stewart at that time was 9 miles away. Think of downtown Stewart, sailing up here, no bridges, 9 miles away. But fortunately, there was a doctor who could sew them up and tend their wounds. And then the next thing he did was he wired his wife. I don't know what it said, but it must have said, "Honey, come quick, I need help." Because she was in Atlanta and she came quickly on the train. Fortunately, there was a train. She had come because the day after the the sinking of the George's Valentine, the storm was still raging, and another ship had gone down 3 miles from here. Of the 16 crew of that ship, 15 made it ashore. The storm was so heavy, the Wilma-like storm was still so heavy, they could not see north or south or north. They couldn't see anything. By chance, they simply let the wind carry them up on the shore, and they came to a shack, the only other shack that was close by. The man there, Harvey, took them in. He realized, though, he could not care for them, he could not feed them for long. So he walked the beach to the house of refuge and brought the 15 other men. So when Mrs. Ray, Harriet, came from Atlanta, came to her house and looked around, there were 22 shipwrecked men. I have counted, we have exactly 22 people over here. This is how many people she saw at her house when she walked in. And she knew she had a lot of work to do. The house had been supplied with cots, metal cots that were up in the loft, and there were 20 cots in the loft, but the men didn't want to sleep in the cots. They thought they were too soft, and so they decided to sleep on the floor in the boathouse. So the men slept in the boathouse, but clothing was a problem. Here they were. They had no clothing. They had been ripped from their bodies. About 20 years previous, they had supplied the house with 20 complete outfits for sailors. There was long underwear. I don't know, they must have been thinking New Jersey. They weren't thinking Florida. There was long underwear, long sleeve, long pant underwear, 20 of those. There were 20 shirts, 20 pants, and 20 jackets. But by the time they needed them in 1904, there were only 5 complete outfits of clothing. They, like the loaves and fishes, they used what they had, and they did clothe the men. As Mrs. Ray said, we clothed each man adequately, if not artistically. I can't imagine. But these clothes pretty soon fell away too, and she put out an SOS for safety pins. And so the ladies came over from Stewart with, thank goodness, safety pins. The food, of course, you've got hungry men. 22 hungry men, plus the keeper and his wife. 24 people in this little house. She said she had a 14-quart dishpan. You'll see it. And so she filled it up with supplies that had been left there. There was spaghetti. She put spaghetti, canned tomatoes, canned roast beef, and lots and lots of seasoning. And the men also loved to fish. That kept them busy. They fished, and so they would they'd clean the fish and throw it into the pot too. So she said we didn't feed them. It was very plain fare, but they enjoyed it. Actually, she said they all enjoyed it quite a bit. She said, I think when they started healing, they were here 3 weeks, by the way. By the time they started healing, she said, I think they liked it here. I know she liked it. She said it was one of the most fun times she had. Captain Ray said it was the nicest group of men he had ever met. I would ask for questions if there are any and if I can answer them. Yes. The hurricane they didn't name them then. I know, it'd be interesting, wouldn't it? They didn't name them then. Actually, they didn't even call them hurricanes. They called them tropical cyclones. They do still now, at times. Pardon? 1904. Just this time of year, 1904. If you go around and read the signs, you'll read a whole lot more about the house and the people and the ships. Thank you.